perhaps thinking about the last 5 or 6 years in the world we inhabit, which is a particular bubble, we would make the observation that most actions to reduce emissions and finance adaptation, certainly since the Paris Agreement, have been well within what we might think of as conventional thinking about how things are done. So to give a couple of examples, we need to reduce subsidies dramatically. In the fossil fuel space, actually, we have really not done that at all. We need to encourage private investors to invest in greener infrastructure and energy systems and mobility, but we've only done that within the logic today of how financial markets work. They measure risk, they think about returns, and if they don't want to make that investment but want to invest instead in coal, they do. Yeah, and so the last 7 years, notwithstanding the huge ambition set out during the Paris Agreement, actually we've been relatively conservative in the instruments and policies and practices that we have played out. And yet, over almost the same period, we have seen some dramatically unconventional policies being played out. And I just wanted to give 2 examples to illustrate the point. Before the financial crisis of 2008, the conventional thinking was you don't print too much money because it causes inflation and undermines economies. But actually, in the light of the great financial crisis of 2008, major central banks from around the world printed not billions but trillions of extra dollars in order to try and boost their domestic economies. So the US, Europe, China in particular, but also other countries, jettisoning that conventional wisdom in favor of a new reality. The COVID pandemic is another case in point, and obviously every country had very different experiences, so I speak narrowly of 1 or 2 examples. Actually, as COVID broke out in 2020 and began to become a phenomena during the first half of that year, major economies, including most of the OECD, but also China, and indeed South Africa and others, committed more than $15 trillion to be spent out in the space of 36 months. Just think about the conversations we're having here at the moment about how to raise an extra few hundred million, maybe a few billion, over a period of 180 days. About 15 economies committed $15 trillion to be spent out in 36 months. Obviously, jettisoning, throwing aside all of the traditional arguments about fiscal probity and one shouldn't raise so much debt and one shouldn't print so much money and one shouldn't support universal incomes, which is actually exactly what many richer countries did. These are examples of unconventional action at a moment of extreme crisis, and they've happened at exactly the same time that in the climate space there has been, in practice, no unconventional actions at all. And so nature finance simply offers as a basis for debate, so exactly to your point, Malini, the question, if actually we can't stay within 1.5 degrees and that our conventional, albeit ambitious actions have had limited impact over the past 5 to 7 years, could it be that opening the door to the fact that we will have to plan for a life beyond 1.5 degrees in every place that we live and work could unlock much more unconventional, disruptive approaches to the way we address those challenges. Now, that's true for every part of society, all the way down to the personal, family, and community level. But it's certainly true for legislators. What are the roles that legislators can or should play if actually one accepts that we're entering into a far more disrupted world. And I wanted to give just two examples, and then Malini, hand back to you. Today, we encourage the financial community, as I said before, to invest in a net zero world, by investing in clean tech, reducing their investment in fossil fuel intensive assets, and we either encourage them to do that by asking them to assess financial risks, arguing that it's in their self-interest to not invest in things that deliver more carbon emissions, or we subsidize them, otherwise known as blended finance. And there are many events going on here over the coming days called blended finance, which are basically using tax dollars to subsidize private capital. But actually, central banks and financial regulators have the instruments and mandate, should they wish to deploy them, to require financial institutions not to invest in certain types of assets and to invest in other types of assets. Every central bank, whether it be in South Africa or Rwanda or the European Central Bank or elsewhere, actually does have the instrument and mandate, and there are many examples of that having happened before, particularly in times of war or acknowledged crisis, but not in the context of climate change at all. So why would it not be that legislators turn to their central banks and required them not to assess financial risk or stability, i.e. look at climate only through a financial risk lens, but rather to require them to get their financial institutions to invest in certain types of assets and not in others. And in the paper, in fact, that we published, as Malini mentioned, we call out the way in which South Africa, in the early stages of the Black economic empowerment agenda, linked some of the regulatory requirements through to what financial institutions could and couldn't and should do in addressing that post-apartheid agenda. Perhaps not a perfect correlation, but certainly an example of requiring the financial community to respond to a policy agenda, not just by assessing risk, but by understanding that they were required to align to those policy outcomes. A second example, and perhaps more contentious, relates to food security. And of course, yesterday, here at COP28, we had big discussions about food, many declarations, many initiatives highlighted, and a great emphasis put on regenerative agriculture. Now, let's not dive into the detail of what regenerative agriculture is or isn't, but maybe let me just illustrate the difference between regenerative agriculture under 1.5 degrees and regenerative agriculture over 1.5 degrees. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, it's a spectrum. If today one invests in soil restoration in Ghana to improve the productivity of cocoa producers, something that Nestle and others are doing as we speak, that may, under certain circumstances, look good if we can restrict temperature increases to below 1.5 degrees. But think of the quality of that soil at 1.7 degrees, 1.8 degrees, 1.9 degrees. In fact, the answer is perfectly simple. There won't be any soil. So today's investment in regenerating the soil, encouraging different forms of agriculture, buying higher productivity and better quality cocoa may look good under one scenario, but actually may be almost irrelevant under a different scenario, at which point one would ask the question, so in a beyond 1.5 degree situation, what would one do in Ghana? How would one support the farming community there? Would it be in the same way that is currently going on today, or something quite different? So to conclude, nature finance probably, fortunately for us and you, are not proposing a set of solutions. We're simply encouraging a reframing of the conversation. A reframing that is not, if you like, a recipe for despair. We're moving beyond 1.5, so there's nothing that can be done. Quite the reverse, is a recipe for more ambitious and more disruptive action, putting aside many of the approaches that we have been taking over recent years that won't be useful in a world disrupted by much higher temperatures, and really beginning to think, what should we be doing given the numbers and the impacts of those numbers that we see already beginning to roll out. So Malini, with that, if I may, I'll pass back to you. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm really interested to hear the conversation to come.
Thank you very much. So Simon and I are elegantly doing this little duet. We'll go on Strictly next. So thank you very much, Simon, for laying the scene, for really giving a synopsis of the paper that you've recently published. I'd also like to recognize that as you were talking about agricultural practices and soil quality in Ghana, we had the Honorable Emmanuel Marfo, who is a Member of Parliament from Ghana and also the chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum Parliamentary Group, join us. So I think you can get some real-time responses from legislators to your example. So before we continue with the rest of the panel, I'd invite you, Hiba, if you can just complete the picture for us from Nature Finance, and then we will invite the parliamentarians to respond. I'm just going to do housekeeping. Could we invite them to keep it at a modest level, please? Yes. So we can hear each other. We don't have to shout. Okay, please. Hiba, floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'd like to extend Simon's comment on the role of central banks, because I think that today it's a bit like the sort of emperor's clothes when we look at the systemic risk that we can actually see in the financial systems. So I would like to take a very concrete example. So if we look at the Basel III requirements, they actually don't include any nature or climate risks at the moment. They announced a few days ago a public consultation where they want banks to assess the risk and see how that might transpire. But ultimately, if the goal of the central banking community is to ensure financial stability and keep inflation at a certain level, then surely we need to also account for nature and the climate impact on our balance sheets. And I think this is really tied to also the banks and the financial community's willingness to invest into the solutions needed, because they have a, I think, false perception of what the risk actually is. So on paper, a lot of the developed countries' investment look like less risk on paper, but ultimately if you take into account the implications of the nature and climate risk, the risk premium should be a lot higher. And we also know for a fact that the majority of the investment needed is in the global south. So I think we need to redefine what risk is, and we need for the banking community to reflect that on their balance sheet. And I think a requirement should be that we take climate into account in the capital requirements.
Okay, thank you very much, Hiba, for laying it out. I also have to say, just as in terms of framing, Simon used the framework of risk management. Yeah, so we've gone quite a long way to recognizing systemic risk. Yeah, within the DRR community. Yeah, so I'm looking at you, Honourable Marfo. So we've seen that the financial institutions are responsive. We're in a different stage now because we've got the IMF's Stability and Resilience Fund, etc. So just to recognize that this is a very fluid, very a moment of great potential that we're discussing all this. Yeah. So let me start the conversation by inviting, so going from right to left, if I may. So inviting Honourable Tebogo Modise from South Africa, your reflections of what you've heard.
No, thank you very much, Madam. Let me greet everybody who's here, including my chief whip from the South Africa and our house chairperson, both of them. Madam, I can say in South Africa, we are experiencing a lot of extremely weather events. Those weather events, you can mention them. I can say droughts, heat waves, and sometimes you experience the floods. And those floods, they can cost the life of our people, and the drought can cost the life of our animals. But South Africa, we have a plan to make sure that we respond on those weather changes that caused by climate change. We are we are having policies that we are implementing, your national development plan, your climate change response policy, and we have such as South Africa has low emission development and just transition framework to overcome all these challenges that I have mentioned. And also, we have the role on the legislation that is driving the climate resilient. Comprehensive legislation is very crucial to establishing the concurrence framework for climate action. We can say we can set a clear target responsibilities in timelines for emission reduction and adaptation measures. The climate change bill, which has been processed by the National Assembly, and now they refer it to the National Council of Provinces. I know you don't understand when I mention the National Council of Provinces. In our country, your Senate, we call it the National Council of Provinces. Then we are busy currently processing it. But by very, very soon, because it is important legislation, by the end of March, we'll be done with that climate change bill, because we need it to make sure that we overcome all these things, the challenges that we are facing as the country. Then we have we have to prioritize the nature-based solution for the climate resilient. The latter speaker mentioned about soil erosion and so on, because why we are focusing on that as a South Africa, we are taking several steps to advance and prioritize the nature-based solution for the climate resilience. As such, through the restoring wetland and helping absorb food water, while we are planting 10 million trees over the millennium term to reduce the soil erosion caused by the heavy rains in our country at some point. So those are the issues that we are focusing on. And also, I can say additionally, we are having a various ongoing environmental program. Those programs will assist to have allocated 2.6 billion, which is your dollars, it's 1.39 million, to clear 1.2 million hectares of land of invasive alien plant over the next 5 years, while also creating much needed 38 jobs. Because for us to do that, we also need to involve our community. We need to create jobs so that everybody must participate on that, because as government alone, we cannot do anything without including our communities. All the sectors that are there, they are part and parcel of reducing the fire risk and water losses. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. And delighted to hear about the passage of the climate bill and its journey to hopefully being signed into law early next year. I want to turn next, please, to the Honourable Francois Umukiza from the East African Legislative Assembly. So again, a little bit of context. In 2015, of course, we signed the Paris Agreement, but in March of that year, world leaders agreed to the new Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. And if I recall correctly, it was the East African Legislative Assembly which was the first, directly on the heels of both of these agreements being signed, which then developed a law on climate change and disaster risk reduction, the first of its type. So, Honourable Françoise, on the basis of what you've heard so far, would love your initial reactions, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be before you today. Actually, we are here to make sure parliaments make COP count. It's very important. First and foremost, I'm glad that you just started by mentioning about the initiatives that are happening at the East African community. As we are members of parliament, I'm with my colleague, Honorable Dr. Wada Jeremiah. You can stand up for recognition, please. All away from Kigali in the plenary sitting. She's the SG, the Secretary General for IAPA. IAPA is East African Parliamentary Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. And she's a member of parliament at Yala like me. So me, I'm the chairperson of the Committee on Agriculture, Tourism and Natural Resources. And when I will be talking of what the initiatives are in East Africa, allow me also to tell you that we are in a good period. COP is happening after the summit of heads of state in EAC have made with the strong commitment toward even this COP. Allow me to tell you that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius calls for an aggressive commitment, not only commitment, but also efforts to cut greenhouse gases emissions from different sources. Because global warming is a global problem, because we're here to make sure we synergize, and also it calls for collective action through creative and innovative solutions at all levels in order to mitigate adverse effects that are already evident. So as far as EAC regions interventions are concerned, the 23rd Ordinary Summit of EAC Heads of State held on 24th November 2023, this just last week, urged partner states to put in place appropriate policy measures and fiscal incentives to attract, then expand and maximize private sector contribution and investments in climate change mitigation and sustainable food system transformation. As we are just trying to make sure we correlate nature finance and also food security, I think the topic is right today so that we can merge the two. And then they urged also partner states to support Africa Green Industrialization Initiative to ensure sustainable exploitation of natural resources and financing of climate change mitigation efforts and food systems. And then, as directed by the heads of state, EAC as a regional climate change policy and strategy to address the adverse impact of climate change in the region and harness any potential opportunities posed by climate change in harmonized and coordinated manner. Then the overall objective of the EAC climate change policy you mentioned about is to guide climate change adaptation and mitigation to reduce the vulnerability of the region and enhance adaptive capacity and build socioeconomic resilience of vulnerable populations and ecosystems. Population, ecosystems, they go together. In order to fully implement this policy, each partner state has put in place relevant policy, legislative and institutional frameworks to operationalize the policy provisions. We have the national interventions. Those national interventions, there is development and implementation of the nationally determined contributions, NDCs. You are all aware of these ones from Paris Agreement. which provides key priority partner states adaptation and mitigation sectors with their interventions in a bid to implement the Paris Agreement, Climate Change Convention, and contribute to the global efforts of limiting temperature increases below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is below. This is the approach of EAC. If we can keep this global warming below 1.5, it will be helpful. Currently, research shows that we are now at 1.2. You see, just 3 degrees less than the 1.5. So we need to work very hard to make sure we don't go beyond this, because it's very key and we shouldn't go beyond. Then we have development and implementation of projects and the program on climate change, focusing on priority adaptation and mitigation. For the case of EAC, harmonization of program and coordination takes place at the regional level. But implementation takes place at the national level. That's why we're talking of NDCs. It's very important to know that. And then I will be talking of kind of experience in partner states. So I'm using my phone. And then let me just give you some experience for the case of EAC. We have the URT. URT is United Republic of Tanzania. It's no longer Tanzania alone, because they are together with mainland and Zanzibar. So it's now URT government. It's investing in climate smart technologies through the Build Better Tomorrow. Build Better Tomorrow. And this one is very important to support youth and women while they are conserving environment. It is also reducing poverty in those groups. And also URT government has dedicated 25% of its national land to forest. This is a very, very important, act or gesture we can appreciate URT to make sure they have a carbon sink, with the private sector also being encouraged to venture in carbon sinking. Then URT as well intends to give tax incentives to encourage private sector investment in green technologies and renewable energies. Republic of Kenya, quickly, the government has prioritized the conservation of its water towers through a massive tree planting campaign. They started lastly with the single-use plastic management, but also the forest cover. And Kenya intends to plant 15 billion trees by 2032. So to protect its environment and conserve its water towers. The country was growing trees for the twin objectives, protecting the environment and making money through carbon trading. It's very important. Republic of Rwanda, I'm just, giving a panoramic view. The government of Rwanda has established special funds.
Sorry. We will not have time to go through every member of the EAC.
Okay.
So I think it's very important that you shared with us the strategies of the East Africa community with regard to climate change adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. But if you can just bring that to a close, and then I'll continue.
Okay, let me
Marianne.
just do kind of, a capitulation of everything. So now I'm going to Yala. Because all those executive initiatives are to be monitored. And also, as EALA, we have 3 core functions. The first one is legislation. Legislation, and our laws are binding, and they take precedence over the national laws, which is a good thing we have. And then we do oversight, and we do representation. That's why we are here, to represent the people of EAC. And EALA has a committee dedicated to agriculture, as I said. It's part of our priorities to make sure through this committee we advocate for maybe the funding, the financial increase when we are debating on the floor of the House, and doing another committee that is dealing with the budget of the community. And then what we do again is that we play a key role in the budgetary cycle, and also advocate for adequate allocation of funds to interventions on climate change. And we also established recently a platform whereby all the members, not only the members of this committee, agriculture and natural resources, all the members are gathered to make sure we find solutions to this global warming, because it's really very key that we make sure we protect our environment, our health, life, protect even, all the ecosystems, if I can just do that. And then, let me also tell you that we are committed to make sure we continue to be the advocates of climate change globally, at continental level, nationally, and also at the regional level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I think the challenge is that all of these strategies that you have mentioned are trying to prevent a world that goes past 1.5 degrees. The challenge before us that Simon has shared is how to adapt and prepare for a world which goes beyond 1.5 degrees. So this is a serious question because it appears that the current legislative frameworks and the policies are not attuned to that massive risk. So this is where Simon is provoking us to think about. And I'm going to come to you next, Barry. And I think, look, serendipity is in the air whenever you are in the room. Because Simon, unbeknownst to you, in our last session, we were talking precisely about soil health, the effects of climate change on food production because of its implications for soil health, and financial systems and financial misdirection into fossil fuel and anti-food production policies. So these are both issues that, Barry, you spoke very spiritedly on. So I would like to come to you for your reflections on what you have heard, because you have read Simon's paper. Your remarks.
Right. Yes, I, as you do when you arrive in a strange city, you sometimes wake up in the middle of the night. I woke up in the middle of the night. I had received an email from Simon or Simon's office, and I read the paper in the middle of the night. And I have to say, all that Simon presented, I think is uncontestable. Because what he did was he set out the scale of the problem that we're facing. If you've read the Intergovernmental Panel 6 assessment report, and you haven't, because none of us have, because it's this thick, literally this thick, two volumes of it. But if you've read the summary even, you know that they're saying that by the turn of the century, on the basis that we're proceeding, we won't be busting through 1.5, we won't be busting through 2 degrees, we'll be at 3.2 degrees. So all that Simon has said about the likelihood of us staying within 1.5 on current measures is absolutely right and uncontestable. My divergence, I think, Simon, from where you are, would be this. In your paper, you imply that a recognition that we are not going to keep within that threshold will in some way galvanize action, that the knowledge of what will happen if we go through that threshold that we already have has not galvanized action. And it seems to me that, and I was just reading a passage from Luke's Gospel. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Luke's Gospel, but there's a wonderful story in it in which a rich and a poor man go to heaven. And at the end of it, the rich man, I think, goes to hell, actually, and he's at the foot, and he says, look, please, go back down, tell my family there really is a heaven and a hell at the end of it, tell them to sort themselves out. And the response that is given is, if they don't believe Moses and the prophets, they will not believe even if a man rises from the dead and tells them. And it seems to me we're in that sort of situation with climate change, right? We know what's going to happen. The science is clear. It takes thousands of pages to set out what the evidence and the data is. The problem is this, that having the data, having that scientific data, that evidence, is not the same as communicating it. Communicating it is not the same as passing policies about it. passing policies about it is not the same. And you see, I thought it was great when you said, Francoise, that, you know, these are mandatory. If the regional parliament passes them, it's mandatory on the countries. Absolutely right, and that's great. But actually, doesn't matter what policies you've got, what laws you've got, unless you enforce them, unless you implement them and enforce them. And so often we don't. And it doesn't matter even if you've got the right policies and you're putting the right subsidies in place, you're putting all the incentives in place. If you cannot take the public with you, if you cannot change behavior on the ground, then the mismatch, the loss, we talked about the losses in the food system, the losses in the system between the scientific data and the public perception and ability to adapt their behavior are just huge. Now, let me just pick up some of the points about the financial sector. There's been a report that came out last month from the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics, backed by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, which says that by 2036, the scale of stranded assets will be between 11 and 14 trillion dollars. Trillion dollars. Now, Simon talked about Ghana and the coffee crop in Ghana, the cocoa cropping in Ghana, and the measures that we're putting in place now not being adequate. If you look at the financial sector and you're talking about that scale of stranded assets, what you're talking about is not just a lot of people losing a lot of money. No, you're talking about the breakdown of the international financial order. Because insurance companies will no longer be able to provide insurance. And if they can't provide insurance, businesses can't operate. If you can't insure your building, if you can't insure your product liability, if you can't do all these things, the whole financial structure breaks down. We know this, but we're still not being galvanized to action at the scale that is required. And so I think the point of my disagreement with you, Simon, is not that I disagree on the likely cataclysm. I think it's on 2 points. One would be that simply acknowledging we are going to go beyond 1.5 degrees will prompt anybody to do anything differently, because the knowledge of that threshold and the knowledge of the disasters that we're facing is not prompting anybody to do the right thing even now to keep within 1.5 degrees. And I know there's the challenge that you anticipate, which is if we say, well, we're never going to save 1.5 degrees, then we lose the incentive to do the things that we need to do. That's not my challenge to you. It's that actually we have to take the sort of actions that we're taking, and Melanie talked about resilience and adaptation and the Sendai framework. Your planting of 58 billion trees, or whatever it was, is actually helping beyond 1.5 degrees. It's building sustainability in, it's building that resilience into the system. Talking about how we improve the organic content of our soils is building resilience in. All the things that we do now on adaptation, on resilience within the Sendai framework. And if, Simon, your point is we need to focus more on adaptation and resilience, then I agree with you. But in fact, all the things that we are currently doing to try to live within the 1.5 degree threshold are, I would say, really important in building that resilience and adaptation into the systems. And you pointed to solutions in your paper, or possible solutions, because you said, look, we're facing a world in which refugees are not going to be numbered in a couple of million. They're going to be numbered in hundreds of millions of people. Because if you see desertification, if you see the loss of agricultural land, if you see the unlivability of areas of the planet where it's beyond 50 degrees, we're going to have massive wholesale relocation and movement of people. Now, you proposed a potential, and you didn't, it wasn't hard and fast, and I accept that, a potential solution, which was, well, maybe we'll see some development of a refugee citizenship. Well, who's going to give it to them? Citizenships are given by nation states. They're given with certain rights that come with citizenship and certain protections that come with citizenship. My God, I have a Home Secretary who went to the United Nations and said, let's rip up the Human Rights Convention because we don't want to give even the rights that refugees already have. So I don't see the putative solutions that you put forward as realizable from a governmental or parliamentarian point of view. And in that sense, I feel that there's, you sucked me in. You sucked me in by my agreeing with you that we're going to hell in a handcart. But then you implied that a knowledge of that, beyond what we already have, and an acceptance of the fact that we're going beyond 1.5 would lead to activities that would in some way mitigate the situation. I don't believe that's true. I think we've got to do absolutely everything we can now, and that will build the resilience that we do need. I agree with you. The likelihood of staying within 1.5 is receding faster than any of us care to think. The consequences of it are terrible. But we also have to be bringing people with us. We have to be connecting the science with the public behavior, and that means presenting them with a vision that they can see a way forward that is not an apocalyptic one. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. That's really, really fantastic contributions, very thoughtful. Simon, you wanted a response, and I think you've got one. If I can just paraphrase, I mean, the purpose of having this jointly with you was to prompt reflection on how we prepare for a hotter world. Several years ago, the World Bank came out with a report which looked at the prospects of the 4-degree world. This is more than a decade ago. And the idea was to prompt decision makers to plan, to prepare for that kind of a world. And that is what we're doing. That's what the financial sector is doing with regard to stranded assets. What we haven't discussed about is stranded nature assets. I think that's part of the discussion. Yesterday, I just want to pick up on a very analogous discussion that we had yesterday with the executive director of the Stop Ecocide Foundation. So their thesis is that we need to get ecocide as a criminal offense in every country's legislation. And ecocide has a very, very specific, very deliberately crafted definition. And why are they doing this? They're doing this because they feel that currently the law is practiced in breach when it comes to environmental offenses and environmental crimes. Because to your point, Barry, it's not being observed. It's not being enforced. So the pushback to that is very typical to the pushback that we've had here. Well, we have a raft of environmental legislation to protect the environment. If that corpus of environmental laws is not enough to protect our habitats, our biodiversity, then why do we need yet something else because it's called ecocide and it criminalizes? So the response to that is twofold. And I just want to frame that because I think that this discussion is very much in that context, which is, first of all, it is normative. You are setting a new norm, and the new norm is that nobody would even think of despoiling the environment because you shouldn't be doing it. And the second, so that changing the norms with the expectation that you are changing policies and behaviors. But secondly, it has the deterrent value. It's deterrent because it's criminal liability and not civil liability. So similarly, we have this discussion with you, which is about what is the value of then saying, well, there's a recognition, and in a sense, it's the truth that dare not speak its name, isn't it? That we are busting through 1.5. And Honorable Francois, you mentioned that the world has already warmed to 1.2 degrees. Well, in parts of the world, like the poles, it's warmed to 5 degrees. Yeah? And actually, today on the news, the latest science is telling us that we are now breaching 1.3 and nearing 1.4. So we are coming very close to the kind of world that, Simon, you are saying policymakers need to sit up and legislators need to sit up and recognize that they have to do their job in preparing the right legislative environment for it. So I'm going to now hand over to you for your reflections on the basis of everything that you've heard, all the input you've got. Yes. If someone can kindly pass the microphone. Or Simon, we can do this exchange again.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
I'll stick here.
Okay.
So thank you all very much for your reflections. I think my comments are not really part of a sort of ping pong match, because I don't think we're collectively trying to prove one thing or another. We're trying to understand something, would be my first comment. There may be a biblical reference to that too, Barry. And so in my opening comments, in giving the example of the great financial crisis and COVID, what I was trying to illustrate is that not all crises are the same. And I don't mean different crises impact on people in different ways. That's obviously true. But there are some types of crises where you get a much more scaled out-of-the-box response. And there are many other types of crises, like climate, where you don't. And so one of the questions many of us in the climate community or concerned about climate have struggled with over the last decade is, how do you make the climate crisis the kind of crisis that the world responds to in a much more dramatic way than the way that it is? And the frustration, of course, is that the world doesn't. Yeah, whereas in the examples of COVID and the great financial crisis, but we could also take many war situations as well, we've seen radical, rapid responses where governments and other actors did things that they wouldn't have dreamt of doing just minutes before. Yeah, and that was the point of the example, which is to ask ourselves the question, is the reason why we can't get the action we want, at least in part, because the crisis is of a nature, despite all our knowledge of it, Barry, to your point, yeah, that it doesn't trigger that sudden flip or paradigm shift in the way in which we deal with things. Let me draw again on the example of refugees, since you raised it yourself. So today there are 114 million forcibly displaced people. Yeah, and that's up from 75 million in 2015. And our crudely model of dealing with displaced people that fits within the post-Second World War humanitarian framework endorsed by 194 governments in the General Assembly is they're displaced, you've got to find a way to keep them safe, and then you either get them home or you give them a passport to a third country. Yeah, it's essentially a pipeline model. Yeah, and it looks very different in different places, but that's essentially how it works. And what we know is that it doesn't work. You go into the camps in Jordan, we have 3 generations of people sitting in the camps in Jordan now, but also elsewhere. But it's still the one that we think about. Now, if I tell you that most estimates of the level of forcibly displaced people in 20 years' time ranges between 500 million and 1.2 billion people, so roughly 10% of the global population, and that none of them will ever get traditional citizenship again in another country. You know, there aren't that many Swedish passports or Turkish passports to go around. It forces us, Barry, to go, well then, our current approach to dealing with it is not one that we just got to double down on. We have to think of a different approach to dealing with the scale of that problem. And actually, I would argue that historically, states didn't give people citizenship. People died to get citizenship. I think people took citizenship, created the notion, and constructed where they could governments that were accountable for the rights that involved, similarly to the trade union movement. You know, workers created trade unions in order to try and force rights onto businesses and governments as well. And so the solution in the paper may be completely the wrong solution. I just wanted to kind of point out its historical precedent. And so if we're moving beyond 1.5 degrees, can we really rely on getting our current policies right as that being the correct response? Or do we have to step back and ask, well, Barry may be right, just doing it as best as we can as we're doing it today is the best that we can do.
I haven't said that. But yeah.
Or one goes, some of the things we're doing today don't make sense if we can solve to a world below 1.5 degrees. But if you've got 1 billion refugees instead of 150 million, you need a completely different type of answer. The story, just very briefly, about the infamous paper that's just been put out by Nick and Mark Carney and others is interesting. Actually, what's really happening is that the value of fossil fuel assets are going up, not down. It's exactly the opposite of the stranded asset theory. Why? Because the financial community has decided that we're not going to do 1.5 degrees, we're going to do 2 to 3. And that means that fossil fuel assets will have unrestricted policy space, whereas solar and other renewable assets will become less valuable because the policy environment doesn't force them to be more profitable. So actually what's happening, Barry, is the opposite of what Mark Carney is saying. Yeah, not what Mark and Nick and Vera are trying to set out. Now, what might that look like in 2032? Frankly, I don't know. We'll be in a 1.6 to 7 degree scenario at that point. So I'm not really sure whether I care at that stage. But what I know today is that Chevron and Exxon just spent $113 billion on buying additional oil reserves. And the CEO of Chevron, when asked, what about climate, replied, on the record, replied, let's be serious. We're going to be using fossil fuels for the foreseeable future, and so I'm buying an incredibly valuable asset. And Chevron is part of a lobbying community that will ensure that policy measures are not executed in a way that strands those assets. And we know that, Barry. Let's be honest about it. And so the idea that somehow the market will solve the problem by stranding the assets because climate change is bad, I think is a completely mythical view, and the data suggests exactly the opposite. So again, I say, under 1.5, we think about the stranded asset model because the policies that keep it under 1.5 would strand those assets. But the moment we're not saying under 1.5, those assets go up in value. Yeah, and we have to find other solutions to deal with them. So this is not, it really isn't to disagree, it's simply kind of putting out there again the core question. If we believe we're going beyond 1.5, do we have to think about other approaches that we haven't executed to date? That's really the only question I'm trying to get onto the map. Thank you.
Thank you. So I really do want to open this up because, Simon, this is a debate that needs to be had. And it's a debate that's been going on for quite some time. In 2009, in India, so my organization at that time, we started a process of reflection on climate security. And it was based on an E3G report called Degrees of Risk in 2009. You remember the Degrees of Risk report? And the presumption of that was that it was an ABC approach. You have to adapt to the current level of warming, but you have to prepare for potential warming of 3 degrees. So we have been talking about this for more than a decade, and it really informs the focus that we see within the UN system on an approach to systemic risk reduction, risk management, and disaster risk response, which is what is represented in the Sendai framework. And the tragedy is that these frameworks, which seek to do precisely what you are arguing for, is to not be the frog in boiling water, but to recognize that we live in a world of cascading and systemic risks, and they have to be prepared for. So this is already in the inbox of governments, let's say, but they've not been responsive to it, partly because they don't know about it. So if I can open the discussion by calling on Honourable Marfo, because one of the things that I do for my sins is I am an advisor to the head of the UNDRR. And every 2 years we publish this report called a Global Assessment on Risks. And last year we had a big focus on finance. This year, every kind of year, it's something different. We had a massive report on droughts. And Honourable Marfo and I are very often on the platforms where we, as parliamentary organisations, as parliamentarians, reflect on how parliaments are picking up the lessons that are coming out of the UN system. Yeah, can't deal with climate change as it is now because you know it's going to get a lot worse. So how are you managing the risk? So your thoughts on this, please, and then open it up to further discussion.
Thank you very much. I didn't hear much of the presentation that he made, but my view will be that first of all we need to come back to basics and ask ourselves what exactly do we do with national accounting in terms of budgets. I say that because if policy is not just the authoritative statement of government, but policy is a structured commitment of resources, if you take that empiricist definition, then the question is that are we doing a budget at national assemblies that reflects what the policy language is? We seem to have a format of doing budget that is fixed on a certain idea of what we think a budget is, but at the policy level, we are also talking about climate change, we are talking about vulnerabilities and risk. That language, does it translate into how we structure budgets? Because if it doesn't translate into how we structure budget, it means that our national budgets will not take into account what we say we will be doing. And that is where the problem is. So essentially, I'm saying that we need to go back and critique or interrogate the very structure of national budgets in Parliament, because these budgets may not be responding to the broader policy rhetoric on climate change, on vulnerabilities, on risk, and so on and so forth. So we will do our budget the same format, that budget. So that is a problem. That is where we probably will need to figure out.
Just 1 second.
Are we okay in terms of volume?
No, the mic's
And
failed.
mics? Has it gone?
So I think that is a very fundamental problem, and maybe that is why some countries are now calling for green budgets. And I mean, those of you who are in Europe now, the European Union has, if you like, institutionalized countries are supposed to demonstrate their investment, their new revenues and expenditures, because we need to go that direction for us to be able to see whether whatever we come to talk or to say, fine, because at the end of the day, everything will boil down to what budget, what financial resources you have committed.
Thank you very much. So we're going to bring the mic back because this is being live streamed, and I know that it's been a very long session. You've been here, many of you, since the morning. So let's bring it to a close in 10 minutes. So final contributions from the audience, and then I'm going to invite each of the panelists to share their final remarks. The lady behind, please.
Yeah, may I stand?
Please do
Yes.
introduce yourself, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Wada Jeremiah. I'm from the East Africa Legislative Assembly. And as she said, I'm the General Secretary for IAPA, which is the Eastern African Parliamentary Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. I really like the discussion because this is my passion and I'm an expert in climate change. One of the things which were said is that the decision makers, which is the executive, I'm a parliamentarian, of course, and I understand that most of us here are parliamentarians. Sometimes our decision makers, who are the executive, they are not made to be aware about the dangers of this increment in the temperature and also of the climate change. And I believe that I can say this of most of the African executive. You know, that's why we as parliamentarians, we have to push a lot. As she said, she's the chair of my committee. As she said, this time around, I'm talking about the African leaders. They're really more aware about the dangers of the climate change because we as parliamentarians, as climate activists, we are making a lot of noise. During the climate change summit in Nairobi, I was so happy. 22 head of states came, they made the declaration, and last week we had a summit of head of state of ESC, and the theme of that summit was acceleration economic recovery through climate actions and enhancing food security for improved livelihood. So it means that now, at least the head of state, the decision makers are aware of this. And just to complement on what my chair said, the ESC has adopted an act in 2015 for disaster risk reduction and management. And that one really helped because it was curbing the effect of man-made hazards on the environment, which is climate change is one of them. And me personally, when I came as a member of parliament in 2018, I moved a motion to bring the ESC climate change bill, which was adopted in 2015. Imagine, adopted in 2015, till now we don't have an action. And then I was given an answer by the head of the council, which is the Council of Ministers, is one body which is an ex-official members of the parliament. They said they will bring it in 2020. Unfortunately, COVID came and we were doing online, but we are now working very hard together with her and some of the parliamentarians to push on the Council of Ministers, on the head of state to bring the ESC climate change bill, which may be one of the articles which we will put in that bill is concerning the global warming, I guess. And if not also, as a regional parliament, now we are 8 countries. Somalia has just been adopted last week. So now if we legislate a piece of legislation on the global warming, it will be on the 8 countries. So you can see the effect will be more. Again, the other problem is that, as he said, the honorable or the gentleman, I like what you said, that we have a lot of legislation, we have a lot of information, but the enforcement come when we raise awareness. If people are not aware, they will not say that this is very important. Now in my community, they're really very, very concerned about DRC problem, okay, about Somalia, about the instability, wars and these things, but they think, okay, this climate change after some years, but if we personalize it to them, okay, if your grandkids, your kids will have this problem, I think it will be something personal and they will be passionate about it. Sorry, I'm talking a lot, and thank you very much. I love the discussion and I wish I was here earlier.
Thank you so much. You know, we need to make these kind of skill shares where we have a bit more time and it can be a bit more conversational. But I think that what you're talking about in terms of the adoption of this new thinking in existing processes of law formation, like with the ALC, this is exactly what we want to do as Globe. We want to make sure that we're bringing the cutting edge thinking, and so you can have legislation which is fit for purpose and not obsolete in a very short space of time. So I'm now going to call on Honourable Cedric Flerick, who wanted to make a comment, and then we'll bring it back to the panel, please.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Just a very brief comment. You know, when I followed the discussion in terms of, when it comes down to finance, the governance framework for that. But the reality is that the current finance that is coming through from different agencies and governments across the world is happening within the UN structure. And within the UN structure, you have governments making submissions, acquiring finance. The World Bank is involved now with the Loss and Damage Fund. But very rarely does members of parliament have sight of exactly what is in that proposal that is there. And that must become our business, because it becomes a bit strange for me when a government minister can say the World Bank is getting it wrong when it comes to adaptation and the programs that is being implemented. What if the World Bank gets it wrong when it comes to loss and damage? So somewhere something is not right. Something is going horribly wrong. Throwing money at the problem will not necessarily solve the problem. And I think that is space that parliamentarians must increasingly occupy to get more involved there. Because if the agencies that go into countries to implement World Bank programs and other programs and money that's being given, adaptation fund money coming in, and parliamentarians see no impact really on the ground, and a government minister come and say, but you guys are actually getting it wrong, then it means that just asking for more money and not knowing what the impact thereof should be could put us in a deeper problem in thinking that we're solving the problem that we're not really addressing. Thank you.
Excellent point. And Honourable Cedric, I just want to commend you, because actually this is something that we've been discussing within Globe, since COP27. And you might recall that we had a really interesting intervention by the Honourable Lawrence Boyuka Songa, in which he gave a really graphic example of how parliamentarians are cut out, even at the committee level. He said, if I want to know what development finance has been claimed received by my government, that audit process is conducted by the Committee on International Development. They're the relationship manager, so to speak. But I, as the chair of the Climate Change Committee, am not able to access the information that my fellow committee has. So even at that level, there is nothing. So one of the conclusions, and we will be sharing this with you in a post-COP statement, is that we think that there is a real need for parliamentarians, as we've always said, to be the monitoring, reporting, verification body, but specifically on climate finance. So just 2 days ago, we had the Loss and Damage Fund agreed. We now know what the governance system is. I was looking at the 18-page document. There is not a single mention of parliaments. There is repeated mention of youth, civil society, environment and development, NGOs, women, indigenous people, but there is not a single mention of parliamentarians. So how are you to know how to go forward and how well funds are being spent if parliaments do not have oversight over the existing myriad funds that there are, whether it's the adaptation fund or the climate, the GCF, etc. So this is going to be one of our quote-unquote issues that we will be campaigning on. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to come to you last, yes, because you will have the final word. So if we can just do a round of your final remarks, please. Thank you very much, starting with yourself, Honourable Modise.
Thank you very much, Madam. Because we have the policies that we have implemented as the Parliament, those policies will enable us to mobilize the finance. Because in South Africa alone, we need close to 1.6 trillion for energy transition. It's for only energy sector. But if you add other sectors, the price will be go high. So really we need those finances. The South African, South Africa, not South Africa, South Africa, Southern Africa Bank. Yes, we need that money from them, and that money, the policies, they must make it easier for everybody, for business people to access those money. Because if their policies are very difficult for them, for the business people or the community to access that funds, we are not going to access it. And that money, we need them as soon as possible to make sure that we combat all the challenges that we are facing of climate change. In conclusion, the South African transition to resilient and low carbon future require as comprehensive legislation framework that will mobilize finance and promote nature-based solution and drives collectives action across all sectors of the society. I will say thank you very much, ma'am. If by the end of this COP, because normally during the COP, other countries, development countries, they came and present, especially the incentive that they have, but I've never had the implementation of those or the access of those finance. So at least from this COP, if they can avail those finance to help other countries that they are in need of those finance, it will be much better for us all over the world to focus and fight with this challenge of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Hiba, swiftly across to you.
Great. So I'll be brief. Scale and speed, that's what we need. And I don't think it will be possible without having enforceable legislation from the central banking community.
Thank you for keeping it brief. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me also be brief. As I was sharing the commitments of countries, allow me also to register that those commitments were taken because of this unlikely event to be below or beyond 1.5, because they can even go 1.8 and so on. Because during the Paris Agreement, it was between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, if you can recall. So the countries are well positioned. And recall that Africa is not the continent that is bringing in the most gas emission on the world. Because Europe and the US, they are having 98.98%. So Africa is not but they are just trying to make sure they keep the environmental protection at, a green, that's why Rwanda is now working on giving the incentives on importation of car using electrical cars, which is a good thing and a good initiative that other countries are trying also to copy. It's good. And also, they're also working on wetlands to conserve the nature, so that they're moving population in Uganda, for instance, to where they can be more secured. So they are well positioned if in an likely event we are beyond this. But it's not what we can wish. We want to work hard so that the developed countries can reduce their gas emissions. And also Africa to keep where they are, but also continue to go down to zero something. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Barry.
Our colleague from the East African, chair of the East African Committees, Dr. Orda, said that if only the leaders could understand that this is their children and their grandchildren. All I would say is look around you. Look at this city. This city is an example of why the leaders are not worried about their children and grandchildren, because people come to this city because they think they can have, the rich think that they can have a bastion where the 1.2 billion people that Simon talked about will just die off, but they and their children will be all right. how else could you account for the fact that in this city, blessed as it is with solar power, is not allowed to put more than 15% of your demand on your rooftop? Or that in Sharjah, you're not allowed to put any solar on your rooftop at all. Why? Because it would undermine the revenues that the oil production are getting for generating your electricity by oil. So here we have a city where you are using an oil generator to power your Tesla car. That's why it's not enough to tell the rich that this is going to affect their children. Okay? It's not. They think they can build a wall. And what we've got to show them is that they can't. Simon, let me end on a note of agreement with you. Because for over a year now, I have been publicly saying in the UK, on television, on anybody who'll listen to me, that we need to be on a war footing. We need to change the way in which we approach climate change. And actually, I think part of it is what was talked about, and the UN's been talking about it for a very long time. It's the system of environmental economic accounting, which we're now beginning to put in place, but not implementing, because we're still basing our economics on a model of GDP growth. And if we could get away from that and have a chief secretary for the Treasury who was not simply there telling you how much your department is allowed to spend in cash terms, but it was telling you how much your department is allowed to spend of natural resources, of your natural capital, and making sure that that was aligned with our NDCs and with a 1.5 degree goal, but making sure that it was, so that government was actually doing what was required to implement its own policy decisions, then we might be able to chart a way forward that is not the sort of disaster that we all think it may be.
Thank you very much. And a reminder to Simon in your concluding remarks that you stand between us and lunch. So brief.
God, I haven't even had breakfast yet, but lunch sounds like a good idea, so I should just stop then, right? But very rapidly, so Nature Finance, the organization that Hibra and I work for, released the paper Time to Plan for a World Beyond 1.5 Degrees because it's true that we need to start planning more for what that really means. And I think what this conversation has demonstrated is that actually there's a lot to discuss. It's very productive, and that actually, far from wanting everybody to agree, I think it's actually quite a good moment to feel high levels of anxiety and to disagree in what ultimately is very productive ways. So with that in mind, again, I wanted, Malini, to thank you and obviously Globe for opening this conversation, to thank the presenters on behalf of at least Nature Finance and also the contributors and listeners for a conversation that I think should continue, and I hope this is a useful contribution to it. Thank you very much.
You can keep that. So I'll just call everything to a close.